In the thick silence of California's Santa Ynez Valley, where the air shimmers from the heat and the hills are covered with sun-scorched grass, stands a monument that history has preferred to forget. This is not an ancient temple, and not the ruins of a military fortress. This is an estate that was once meant to become an earthly paradise for one of the richest people of the 20th century. Today, its gates are closed, and its vast halls, filled with the echo of the past, keep silent. If you drive by, you are unlikely to guess that right here, behind the high fences, hides the true soul of the man who changed the way all humanity eats. We are used to seeing his legacy on every corner of any city in the world. Bright yellow lights, the smell of fried potatoes, the promise of quick happiness for a couple of dollars. But here, in this abandoned ranch, there are no lines, no cash registers, no smiling employees. Here there is only dust settling on expensive furniture from the 70s, and the ghost of ambition that knew no bounds. Why has the place built by the creator of the world's most recognizable empire been erased from collective memory? Why do biographers prefer to talk about restaurants and deals, shyly bypassing these 554 acres of land? The answer does not lie in the bricks and not in the hectares. The answer lies in the dark psychology of success, the price for which had to be paid not with money, but with human closeness. We stand on the threshold of a history that will overturn your perception of the American dream. This is not a story about business. This is a Greek tragedy played out in the scenery of California. The man who built this house was named Raymond Albert Kroc. To the world, he was a marketing genius, a legend, the embodiment of success. But to himself, he remained a failure for a long time. It is important to understand this contrast to feel the drama of this house. Ray Kroc was not a wunderkind. He did not found his empire in a garage at 20 like modern tech billionaires. When real success came to him, his face was already covered with deep wrinkles, and his body knew the fatigue from decades of fruitless struggle. 52 years. Ponder this number. For 52 years, he was just a salesman. He sold paper cups. He played piano in bars for pennies. He traveled the country trying to sell heavy, unwanted multi-mixers. For most of his life, he was an invisible man, one of millions trying to survive in the harsh system of capitalism. That is why, when fate suddenly gave him a chance, when the small McDonald brothers diner turned into a global monster in his hands, he did not just get rich. He went mad with the desire to prove to the world that he exists. This ranch, which he named J&AR Double Arch Ranch, became his cry. It was not just a vacation home. It was a manifesto of the former paper cup salesman who suddenly became richer than kings. But the paradox is that in building this palace, he was not building it for a family in the classical sense. He was building a fortress for himself and that one woman for whom he destroyed his previous life. No one knew that behind the facade of public success and charity hid a deep, soul-corroding drama. This house saw not only solemn receptions, it saw the fear of aging. It saw how the greatest business strategist lost control over the simplest thing, over his own emotions. The story of this estate is the story of what happens when a person gets everything he dreamed of, but discovers that inside the golden cage, there is less air than in freedom. We are used to thinking of Ray Kroc as a tough businessman who stole the idea from the founding brothers. But the truth is much more complex and tragic. Today we will open the heavy doors of this mansion. We will walk through the corridors where the carpets still remember the steps of their owners. We will see the roundhouse on the hill from which Ray looked at his possessions like a monarch awaiting an attack. We will try to understand why, having all the gold in the world, he chose this isolated valley, and why, after his departure, this place seemed to freeze in time, turning into a mausoleum of unfulfilled hopes. Forget the glossy covers of business magazines. Forget the corporate legends about the clown Ronald. The real story doesn't smell like burgers. It smells like expensive whiskey, old wood, and loneliness that cannot be drowned out even by billions of dollars. Before us is J&R Ranch, and it is ready to tell its darkest secret, if you are ready to listen. To understand why this mansion in the Santa Ynez Valley looks exactly like this, monumental, somewhat aggressive, and absolutely isolated, we need to rewind the tape back, far beyond the 60s. We must find ourselves at the beginning of the century, in the town of Oak Park, Illinois, in October 1902. It was then, in the family of Czech immigrants, that the man was born whose worldview would later be frozen in the stone and glass of the California ranch. Ray Kroc was not an heir to blue blood. His father worked for a telegraph company, and his mother taught him to play the piano. This detail is important. Music gave him a sense of rhythm, but the street gave him the understanding that the world owes you nothing. The philosophy that would later build an empire and this vast estate was not born in business schools. It was born in the dirt and endless work. At 15, he lied about his age to become an ambulance driver in the war, where his fellow serviceman was another dreamer, Walt Disney. But while Disney went into the world of fantasies, Kroc went into the world of harsh reality. He sold everything. Paper cups from the Lily Tulip Company, land plots in Florida when there was a boom there, and finally, heavy, clumsy multi-mixers. Imagine this life. 30 years on the road. 30 years of cheap motels, smoke-filled train cars, and heavy suitcases with samples. For 30 years, he heard the word no more often than his own name. This forms a certain type of psyche. Predatory, distrustful, and thirsty for revenge. It was precisely this experience of endless humiliation and hard labor that created the foundation for his main strategy: persistence. Later, he would write this word with a capital letter. He would make it his religion. When he bought the land in Santa Ynez, it would not just be a real estate purchase. It would be an act of affirmation. I survived. I won. The ranch was to become proof that a paper cup salesman could look down on those who once closed doors in his face. The turning point that led him to wealth and to this house happened in 1954. Ray was 52. He had arthritis, diabetes was starting to make itself known, and he had nothing but a mortgage and the fear of poverty. He went to San Bernardino, California, to find out why one small restaurant was ordering so many of his mixers. What he saw, others considered just a popular diner. Ray saw an assembly line there. He saw a symphony of efficiency. The McDonald brothers created a system, but they had no ambitions to conquer the world. Ray had no system, but his ambitions were the size of the planet. Here begins the main social conflict of his life. Ray Kroc was a man of new money in its brightest manifestation. When in the mid-60s the company went public and a golden rain poured down on him, high society still looked at him askance. For the old aristocracy, he was the guy who fries patties. He was not admitted to the closed clubs of the East Coast elite. His manners were considered rude, his suits too bright, his speech too direct. And here the ranch strategy appears. If society does not accept you into its palaces, you build your own, which will be bigger, more expensive, and grander than theirs. He chose the Santa Ynez Valley not by chance. These were cowboy lands, lands of the Wild West, not the manicured gardens of Beverly Hills. It was the choice of a rebel. Ray saw himself as a pioneer, a modern gold prospector. He bought these 554 acres of land right after the company's shares skyrocketed in 1965. It was the time when he could finally shed the mask of a modest partner and show his true face, the face of an emperor. His worldview was paradoxical, and this was reflected in the architecture of his future refuge. On one hand, he was a fanatic of cleanliness and standardization. Every patty must weigh exactly 1.6 of an ounce. Every pickle must lie in a specific place. He demanded predictability from the world. But on the other hand, he was a gambler, ready to stake everything. In 1961, he mortgaged all his property to buy out the rights from the McDonald brothers for $2,700,000, a sum that seemed astronomical at the time. His hands trembled when he signed the check, but his eyes burned. This house, which we are exploring, became the physical embodiment of this duality. He built it as a fortress of order amid the chaos of wild nature. He wanted to control every inch of this land, just as he controlled every franchise from New York to Tokyo. But behind this pursuit of control hid the deep insecurity of a man who had been nobody for too long. He fought not only against business competitors, he fought against his own past, against the image of the failed traveling salesman. The J&R Ranch was supposed to become a place where time stops, where there are no calls from creditors, no capricious franchisees, no endless race. But the irony of fate was that the man who built a business on speed and fast service could not stop. He brought his obsession with details to this quiet corner of California. He could not simply enjoy the sunset. He had to own the sunset. He had to make sure that the sun sets exactly as prescribed in his internal charter. Thus, before us is not just the story of building a house. This is the story of how the philosophy of victory at any cost seeks refuge. Ray Kroc, son of Czech immigrants, failed pianist, paper cup salesman, by the end of the 60s turned into one of the most influential people in America. And he needed a stage befitting his new role. But this play was missing one main heroine. The king needed a queen. And it was precisely the appearance of this woman, whose name would be woven into the name of the ranch, that would change everything. Their union would become the fuel that turns a simply rich house into a legend full of passion, vodka, and quiet sorrow. But to understand this union, we need to see how two worlds collided to create an explosion whose echo is still heard in the empty corridors of the ranch. If Ray Kroc was the engine of this story, the tireless piston pumping energy and ambition, then the fuel that made this mechanism shine with blinding brilliance was a woman. By the end of the 60s, a turning point came in Ray's life that forever changed not only his fate, but also the physical appearance of the ranch in the Santa Ynez Valley. Until that moment, his success was dry, mathematical, devoid of aesthetics. He needed someone who would turn his rough money into shining grandeur. In 1969, when the world watched the moon landing with bated breath, Ray Kroc made his own landing. He finally married the woman he had pursued, loved, and waited for more than 10 years. Her name was Joan Beverly Mansfield, and her appearance in this story is like turning on the light in a dark room. Their meeting happened long before the construction of the ranch, in 1957, in the Criterion Restaurant in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a scene worthy of a Hollywood melodrama. A 50-year-old salesman, not yet a billionaire, enters the hall and sees a dazzling blonde playing the Hammond organ. Joan was the embodiment of that class and elegance that Ray had always lacked. She was 26 years younger than him, she was married to another, he was married to another. But the chemistry between them was instantaneous and destructive. This union was not just a romantic fling, it was a strategic merger of two worlds. Ray brought to this marriage animal tenacity and endless resources. Joan brought taste, social intelligence, and the ability to smooth the sharp edges of his unbearable character. The wedding in 1969 became not just a formality, but a coronation. It was precisely at this moment that the ranch in California acquired its true purpose and its legendary name. J&R Double Arch Ranch. J is Joan, R is Ray, and Double Arch is that very McDonald's symbol that made all this possible. Notice this cynicism and romance at the same time. Even in the name of his personal paradise, his refuge from business, Ray could not give up corporate branding. The golden arches, a symbol of cheap food, here transformed into the coat of arms of the new American aristocracy. It was a merger of bed and accounting, love and logo. With Joan's appearance, the ranch project ceased to be just a land plot of a rich retiree. It began to turn into a stage for demonstrating their new status. Ray was no longer just the Burger King. Thanks to Joan, he was becoming a patron, a philanthropist, a member of high society. The land in the Santa Ynez Valley was chosen not by chance. This was a place where old California money met wild nature. Ronald Reagan, the future president, had a ranch nearby. Michael Jackson would later build his Neverland in the same valley. It was a club of the elite, and Ray Kroc, armed with his checkbook and his wife's impeccable taste, intended to become the chairman of this club. Grand construction began, which was to unite these two polar worlds, Ray's rough functionality and Joan's refined aesthetics. The landscape began to change. Where cattle used to roam and dry grass grew, outlines of something alien began to appear. Ray wanted to see everything. He wanted to control the horizon. Therefore, for the main living space, a place on an elevation was chosen, from which a panoramic view of all 554 acres opened. This was not just building a house, it was creating an autonomous state. Ray, who had depended on suppliers, banks, and franchisees all his life, wanted absolute independence here. Joan brought softness to the project that Ray never had. If Ray thought about scale, helicopter pads, huge conference halls, industrial kitchens, Joan thought about atmosphere. It was precisely this conflict of interests, scale versus coziness, corporation versus family, that laid the foundation for the future architectural drama. The ranch was becoming the physical embodiment of their marriage. On the outside, a powerful, impregnable fortress of success. On the inside, a complex interweaving of compromises, passion, and the struggle for dominance. The union of Ray and Joan transformed Kroc's position in society. Before Joan, he was perceived as a nouveau riche. With Joan, he became part of the elite. She taught him to spend money in a way that evoked respect rather than smirks. And the ranch was to become the main tool of this influence. They planned to invite here not only potato sales managers, but also politicians, movie stars, influential people of the era. It was a strategic foothold. The house was designed so that every visitor immediately understood, here lives the man who feeds America. But behind the facade of this brilliant union hid a dark side as well. Ray adored Joan, he idolized her, but he also wanted to possess her completely, as he possessed the controlling stake in the shares. The ranch, with its remoteness from big cities, with its fences and security, was ideal for this purpose. It was a golden cage, built with love and paranoia. Joan gained access to unlimited resources, but the price for it was a life in isolation under the scrutiny of her husband's watchful eyes, who became increasingly jealous and demanding as he aged. Thus, on the cusp of the 70s, among the California hills, this architectural monster began to grow. A mixture of ranch-style rural aesthetics and futuristic ambitions, adorned with the owner's initials. The old met the new. Traditions of the American West intertwined with the aggressive capitalism of the 20th century. Stone, wood, and glass were preparing to receive their owners. Everything was ready for the flowering of grandeur. But no one yet knew that it would be the architecture of this house, its endless corridors and vast, empty spaces, that would become the best psychoanalyst for Ray Kroc, mercilessly exposing the emptiness that cannot be filled even with all the burgers in the world. We approach the doors to enter inside and see what success looks like from within. When the massive ranch gates, once adorned with the symbolism of intertwined letters, open before you, the first thing that catches the eye is not luxury, but the frightening scale of emptiness. We enter a space that was designed not so much for living as for demonstrating dominance over the landscape. Architecture here acts as the most honest biographer of Ray Kroc, telling about his fears and desires far more than any corporate book. Let's walk through this museum of ambitions, where every room is a cast of the consciousness of the man who wanted to feed the entire world, but himself remained eternally hungry for recognition. The heart of the complex is the so-called lodge. This is not just a house, it is a colossal structure of 17,000 square feet. Imagine a space that more resembles the lobby of an elite hotel or a corporate headquarters than a cozy family nest. There is no place for intimacy here. The huge conference hall, capable of seating more than 60 people, and the dining room for 100 persons, tell us one thing. Ray Kroc never turned off the businessman inside himself. Even here, amid the California nature, he prepared for negotiations. The walls of this hall are paneled with expensive, dark wood that has absorbed the smell of cigars and the tension of multi-million-dollar deals. When you stand in the center of this room, you physically feel the loneliness of the leader. Here, the echo of your steps sounds louder than it should, reminding you that this space was created for an audience, not for heart-to-heart talks. But the most paradoxical room in the lodge is the kitchen. If you expect to see a cozy home kitchen with the smell of pies, you are mistaken. Here is installed a full-fledged industrial kitchen made of stainless steel, exactly like those in the world's best restaurants. The cold gleam of metal, powerful hoods, professional equipment. This was a laboratory. Legends say that it was right here, away from prying eyes, that Ray personally tested new products that later appeared on the menus of thousands of restaurants. They say that the taste of the famous Egg McMuffin was perfected precisely on these chrome surfaces. This room is the key to Kroc's psychology. For him, food was not a pleasure, but a standard. Even at home, he lived surrounded by sterile efficiency, where every process had to be calibrated to the second. From the lodge, we move to another iconic building, the library, or Founders Building. This is the place where Ray wanted to appear as an intellectual, philanthropist, man of science. Medical books were stored here, supporting his brother Bob's research. But architecture does not know how to lie. Behind the massive panels of noble wood hid a detail that speaks more about the owner's tragedy than thousands of volumes on the shelves. A hidden bar. Not just a cabinet with drinks, but a disguised refuge. Press the right panel and the wall slides away, opening access to racks of bottles. Ray Kroc loved early times whiskey. This was the drink of his youth. Cheap, harsh, reminiscent of the times when he was nobody. And here, surrounded by millions of dollars, he hid this habit behind a facade of respectability. This secret bar is an architectural symbol of his struggle with demons, which he lost every evening. However, the true crown of the estate, its most personal and strange element, is the roundhouse, located on top of the hill. Built in 1971, this house is a manifesto of the panopticon. It has the shape of a perfect circle and 360-degree glazing. Why does a person need a house from which everything around is visible, but in which there is nowhere to hide? This is the psychology of control. Ray wanted to see his possessions. From this summit, he could observe every movement on his 554 acres. He saw 2 artificial lakes where swans swam, black and white, living symbols of yin and yang, imported specifically for Joan's visual delight. The interior of the roundhouse is the quintessence of the 70s. Here reigns an aesthetic that today would be called kitsch, but back then it was the peak of fashion. Orange and brown tones, deep shag carpets in which the foot sinks, massive furniture of rounded forms. In the center is a huge fireplace around which life revolved. But the most important thing is the initials, J and R. They are everywhere. They are carved into the wood, cast in metal, woven into the patterns of stained glass. This is not just decor. It is a brand of ownership. Ray was marking his territory. He seemed to shout to every guest, "This is mine. This is us. This is our union." But the more of these signs you see, the more insistent the thought becomes. Happy people do not need to write their names on the walls to remember who they are. Special attention should be paid to the bedroom in the roundhouse. It is designed so that the first rays of the sun wake the owner, and the sunset escorts him to sleep. A huge bed standing on a platform like a throne. Lying here, Ray and Joan were king and queen of their world, separated from reality by glass walls. But glass has the property not only of opening the view, but also of reflecting. At night, when the valley plunged into darkness, these windows turned into black mirrors. And in these mirrors, Ray Kroc saw not his millions, but his aging face. The house was full of technical innovations of that time, a complex intercom system allowing connection to any point on the ranch, a helicopter pad ready to receive guests at any moment. Everything was created for life at high speed. But the paradox was that time for Ray was slowing down. 72, 73, 74. The architecture of grandeur was completed, the stage was built, the scenery set, the lights turned on. But the play that began to unfold within these walls turned out to be not at all the heroic saga that the author had planned. Instead of the triumph of will, the rooms began to fill with the heavy air of disappointment and human drama. Walking today through these empty halls, where the carpets still hold the imprints of furniture and the air is stale from time, we do not feel admiration for wealth. We feel cold. This is not the cold from air conditioners, but from the understanding that this huge palace was a golden cage for 2 very lonely people. Grandeur turned into isolation. And it was precisely here, amid luxury and designer solutions, that the real human tragedy began to unfold, where love struggled with addiction and ambitions with death. We move to the most painful part of our story, to what was hidden behind the closed doors of the roundhouse when the lights went out and only the gleam in a glass of whiskey remained. Behind the blinding facade of grandeur, amid the shine of stainless steel and panoramic views of the Santa Ynez Valley, hid another, much darker reality. We approached the moment when the golden arches ceased to be a symbol of triumph and turn into the bars of the most expensive prison in California. The main conflict playing out within the walls of the Roundhouse was not related to stock quotes or competitors from Burger King. The enemy was inside. This enemy's name was silence, which Ray Kroc, a man of furious energy and constant noise, could not endure. To drown out this silence, he used a tried-and-true remedy that had accompanied him since his days as a pianist in Chicago jazz clubs: whiskey. Cheap, harsh, early-times bourbon. This seems an incredible paradox. A man whose fortune was valued in hundreds of millions of dollars, a man who could afford collectible wines from French cellars, stubbornly drank a working-class drink. This was not just a habit. It was an umbilical cord linking him to that hungry, angry salesman he had been for most of his life. But if alcohol gave him boldness in his youth, in old age, in the isolation of the ranch, it turned him into a tyrant. Accounts from those years paint a frightening picture. Evenings at the ranch often turned into psychological duels. Ray, whose temper became legendary in business, he could fire a person for the wrong color of socks. At home, had no subordinates on whom to vent his anger. The only spectator and only victim of this one-man theater became Joan, the woman for whom he moved mountains, the woman whose name was intertwined with his own on the estate gates, found herself locked in a golden cage with a raging lion. Their love, which began as a passionate romance of two adventurers, transformed into a painful addiction. Joan was his muse, but she also became his main target. Here we see the deep moral ambivalence of Kroc's figure. On one side, a genius who gave jobs to millions of teenagers, a philanthropist donating to medicine. On the other, a domestic despot whose love was suffocating. Can we judge him? Or is this the inevitable professional deformation of a man accustomed to controlling every little thing? Ray tried to control Joan, just as he controlled the standards of patty grilling. He was jealous of her for every glance, every sigh. The ranch, with its remoteness and security system, was ideal for isolation. Joan Mansfield, the brilliant social lioness, often felt here not as the mistress, but as the most valuable exhibit in the collection of a mad curator. The tragedy intensified when biology began to take its toll. At the end of the 70s, Ray's health faltered. The man who built an empire on speed suddenly found himself chained to the slow rhythm of illness. A series of strokes turned the energetic predator into an invalid. And here, the house's architecture played a cruel joke on him. That very round house on top of the hill, conceived as a captain's bridge, turned into a watchtower from which escape was impossible. Ray sat in his chair, looking through the panoramic windows at his possessions, at the swans in the lake, at the hills. But he could no longer descend to them. He became a prisoner of his own grandeur. At this moment, Joan's transformation occurs. From a victim of circumstances, she turns into a caregiver, a guardian, Ray's only connection to reality. This is classic, almost Shakespearean irony. The one who held the leash now fully depended on the one on whom the leash was. Joan cared for him with devotion that commanded respect even from critics, but in her eyes was an inexpressible sadness. This was not just fatigue. This was the realization of emptiness. They were richer than Croesus, but in these vast halls adorned with expensive paintings and antiques, there was no simple human happiness. There was only sterile cleanliness, the smell of medicines, and the hollow echo of the television. The moral layer of this story becomes tangible when we look at the charity of that period. Ray and Joan began donating huge sums. Was it a sincere impulse, or an attempt to buy off fate? An attempt to fill the soul's emptiness with checks bearing 6 zeros. Ray founded Operation Cork. Operation Cork, Kroc backwards, a program to combat alcoholism. Ponder this cynicism and tragedy. The man who destroyed himself with whiskey every evening funded programs to treat alcoholics. It was an acknowledgement of the problem he could not solve in himself, but tried to solve in others. It was a cry for help, masked as philanthropy. In those years, the ranch became saturated with an atmosphere of awaiting the end. Guests came less and less frequently. Poolside parties became a thing of the past. The house turned into a mausoleum while its owner was still alive.
Staff who worked at the ranch recalled that Ray could sit silently for hours, gazing at the setting sun.
What was the Burger King thinking in those moments? Did he regret sacrificing his relationship with his daughter and first wife for this success? Did he realize that all these acres of land could not add a single day to his life? The culmination of this personal tragedy was Ray's inability to enjoy the fruits of his labor. He built paradise, but lived in the hell of his own infirmity and anger. Joan, who had been the catalyst for his late success, now became the witness to his decline. She saw the great mind fade, leaving behind only a capricious old man. But it was precisely in this crucible of suffering that Joan's character was forged, which would play a decisive role after her husband's death. While Ray clung to life and control, she began to rethink the very notion of wealth. She saw that money had not brought them peace. And this understanding prepared the ground for one of the most unexpected turns in the history of American inheritance. Ray Kroc, the creator of the happiest brand on earth, died in an atmosphere of deep unhappiness. His ambition devoured him. And when, on January 14, 1984, the heart of the McDonald's founder stopped, the ranch plunged not into mourning, but into a strange, ringing silence. A silence that foreshadowed a storm of change. The king was dead. But what would become of the kingdom, and the queen who finally received the keys to the cage? The answer to this question will overturn the meaning of everything that was built. On January 14, 1984, Ray Kroc's heart stopped, and with it, time stopped in the vast estate in the Santa Ynez Valley. The death of the patriarch became not just the finale of a biography, but the beginning of a massive existential crisis for everything he built.
Suddenly, the golden arches on the gates,
The roundhouse on the hill, and miles of fences lost their semantic center. The empire remained, but the emperor left, leaving behind a widow who, to the surprise of the whole world, did not intend to be just a keeper of museum dust. The moment of truth arrives, when history makes a sharp turn, transforming the plot from a business chronicle into a parable about redemption and the search for meaning. Joan Kroc, the woman who for years lived in the shadow of her husband's gigantic ego, suddenly found herself the possessor of a fortune that is hard even to imagine. But instead of continuing the life of a social lioness hosting balls in her California castle, she makes a decision that shocks the elite. She decides that these burger money, earned through hard labor, tough deals, and selling cheap food, must be cleansed. She saw how ambitions destroyed Ray from the inside, and she did not want this legacy to become a curse.
her response to her husband's death was radical.
She decided to turn egoism into service. The first object of this spiritual transformation was to be the J&R Ranch itself. Joan, looking at the empty halls where laughter and the clink of glasses once sounded, saw in them not a monument to wealth, but potential refuge for the suffering. She came up with a plan that could have become the most beautiful finale to the house's story. She wanted to turn the estate into a health camp for children with cancer. Imagine this picture: a place built for the pleasure of one billionaire, becomes paradise for children whose lives hang by a thread. Pools, swan lakes, huge kitchens. All this was to serve those who needed it most. She wanted to name this place Ronald McDonald Camp, but infuse it not with a corporate, but a deeply personal, maternal meaning. And here, the most cruel and cynical act of social drama played out.
Those very neighbors, that very California aristocracy into whose circle Ray Kroc had desperately tried to enter all his life, slammed the doors in Joan's face. The residents of the Santa Ynez Valley, owners of neighboring ranches, rich and influential people, united in a front against this noble plan. They did not want to see buses with sick children on their private roads. They were afraid of the noise. They were afraid that it would lower the value of their real estate. This was the moment of truth. Ray built a fortress to be one of them among the elite. But this elite rejected his last posthumous gesture of goodwill. Cruel irony. Money can buy land, but it cannot buy neighbors' mercy. Faced with this cold refusal, Joan realized that the ranch could not be saved in the form she wanted. It was too steeped in the spirit of exclusivity and isolation. The dream of children's laughter in the lodge corridors shattered against the rocks of human indifference. In 1990, 6 years after her husband's death, Joan makes a difficult decision. She sells the ranch. She gets rid of the golden cage. The buyer becomes Gerald Kessler, another magnate who made his fortune in vitamin production. But this sale did not become the end of the house's story, but only the beginning of its transformation into a legend of frozen time. Kessler, as if sensing the powerful energy of the place, decided not to change anything. He mothballed the house, turning it into an unofficial museum of the 70s. However, the real transformation happened not with the real estate, but with Joan herself and the empire's money. Freed from the house, she began one of the most massive philanthropic campaigns in U.S. history. And this was not just charity, it was a rebellion. Joan began funding projects that would probably make conservative Ray turn in his grave. She became the Angel of Peace, donating millions to nuclear disarmament movements. She gave $1.5 billion to the Salvation Army. She sponsored National Public Radio, hospices, universities. This was an act of transcendence. Joan redefined wealth. For Ray, money was a way of counting, proof of victory, a tool of control. For Joan, money became energy that needs to be returned to the world to heal its wounds. She turned the dirty money of capitalism into the clean money of humanism. Every check she signed was a kind of dialogue with her deceased husband. You wanted power. I choose care. You built walls. I build bridges. But what about the ranch? While Joan was changing the world, the house in the Santa Ynez Valley fell into slumber. After Kessler's death, it remained standing as a monument to a bygone era. It turned into that very time capsule we talked about at the beginning. New owners came and went, but the spirit of Ray Kroc, his aesthetics, his initials on the fireplaces, his orange carpets, all this remained untouched. The house became a hostage to its past grandeur. It became too specific, too personal, for anyone else to call it their own. In this lies the deep philosophical meaning of the crisis we observe. Material legacy is fragile and often becomes a burden. The ranch, into which millions were invested, became an unwanted giant standing in the silence of the hills. And the immaterial legacy, Joan's decisions, lives saved, supported initiatives, gained immortality. The conflict between having and being
resolved in favor of the latter. But the price for this was the oblivion of that very house that was supposed to stand forever. We approach the finale of our story with the understanding that the true drama played out not at the moment of construction, but at the moment of decay. The J&AR Ranch was Ray Kroc's attempt to buy immortality through concrete and land. But true immortality was gained by Joan, who understood that the only way to preserve wealth is to give it away.
The house remained an empty vessel, a beautiful shell without content. A reminder that even the highest walls cannot protect from loneliness, and the largest gates cannot save from death. Now, all that remains for us is to sum up and see what lesson this abandoned palace carries for us today as we stand on its threshold in the 21st century. The story is ready for its final chord. Today, as the sun sets behind the hills of the Santa Ynez Valley, painting the dry grass in the color of molten gold, the J&R Ranch stands in majestic, almost sacred silence. This is the silence not of peace, but of oblivion. If you peek through the windows of the Roundhouse in 2025, you will see a surreal picture. Interiors screaming of 70s fashion frozen like a fly in amber. Orange carpets that once sprang under the feet of the empire's creator are now covered with a thin layer of the dust of time. This place became what Ray Kroc feared most, a museum of the past where no one buys tickets. The story of this house has come full circle, turning from a symbol of absolute power into a monument to the vanity of the material world. The legacy left by this architectural complex goes far beyond real estate. It is a cruel but honest lesson for the modern world obsessed with success. We live in an era of achievement culture, when new tech billionaires build bunkers in Hawaii and launch rockets into space, repeating the same path that the mixer salesman took half a century ago. Kroc's Ranch is a mirror worth looking into for everyone who believes that happiness can be built from concrete and glass. It tells us, you can buy 554 acres of land, you can change the landscape and redirect rivers into new channels, but you cannot make these walls love you. The paradox of Ray Kroc's legacy lies in the global rift between his public and private image. On the streets of any city in the world, his golden arches shine. There it is noisy. There it smells of fried potatoes. There, millions of people get their quick calories. This is a living, pulsating business organism. But here, in his personal sanctuary, dead silence. This is the price for a philosophy that placed efficiency above humanity. Ray built a house fortress to wall himself off from the world he fed, and the world reciprocated. It forgot about his house. People remember the taste of the hamburger, but no one remembers the taste of its creator's loneliness. Joan's story adds the necessary note of hope and redemption to this finale. Her decision not to cling to bricks, but to turn capital into help, became a true monument to their union. If Ray built pyramids for himself, Joan built bridges for others. $1.5 billion given to the Salvation Army became that very eternal flame that burns brighter than any fireplace in their abandoned lodge. She proved that the only thing we can take with us into eternity is what we gave away. Her legacy is dissolved in the music of public radio stations, in cancer research, in homeless shelters. She dismantled the golden cage twig by twig and gave the gold to those who needed it more. Comparing this saga to the great plots of world culture, it is impossible not to notice the parallel with Citizen Kane and his Xanadu castle. Like the fictional media magnate Charles Foster Kane, Ray Kroc died in his huge, inaccessible estate, surrounded by things that had lost their meaning. His rosebud, symbol of lost happiness, was perhaps not childhood sleds, but that very first simple taste of success, when he was just a salesman full of hopes, not a tired emperor. Or maybe it was the initials J and R, carved everywhere like a spell meant to hold on to love that was slipping through his fingers. Today, the ranch in the Santa Ynez Valley awaits a new owner. It was listed for sale for $29 million. Then the price dropped. But buyers are in no hurry, perhaps because along with the land and walls, you buy the heavy aura of this story. You buy the ghost of ambition that knew no bounds. To the modern viewer, to you and me, this abandoned estate whispers a simple truth. Do not build monuments to yourself during your lifetime. Time is the most merciless critic, and it turns even the strongest stone to dust. Imagine how the wind sways the grass at the gates where proud letters once hung. The swans perhaps have long disappeared, but the lakes still reflect the sky. The house stands as a great lesson. Ray Kroc changed the world, but could not change the laws of being. He sold billions of burgers, but could not buy immortality with money. And in this, perhaps, lies the highest justice. True human greatness is measured not by the square footage of his mansion, but by the emptiness that forms in people's hearts after his departure. In the case of the J&R Ranch, it is simply emptiness in the corridors. And this is the loudest warning that history has left us as inheritance.